From Third World to First, the Singapore Story, 1965 to 2000. The author, Singapore's controversial and charismatic founding father, Lee Kuan Yew. In a matter of 3 decades, Singapore moved from a third world economy to a first world economy, guided ably by Lee Kuan Yew, who chose to be correct rather than politically correct. Welcome to The Why in History. I am Ajay Kaur, and today we trace the modern history of Singapore and its evolution towards becoming a globally competitive world economy. In January of 1819, Sir Stamford Raffles of the British East India Company was searching for a trading site in the East Asia Pacific region. He was forestalled by the Dutch at the Indonesian island of Rayu, so he finally landed at Singapore. He found a few Chinese planters and a few Malays and was told by the local chief that he could purchase land. In reality, this region was under Dutch surveillance. But defying the strict orders from corporate British East India Company not to offend the Dutch, Raffles installed the chief's elder brother to validate the purchase of land on behalf of the company. The Dutch protested, but the company headquarters in London decided to take no action. Subsequently, in 1824, an Anglo-Dutch treaty left Malaya and Singapore in the British sphere, and in August of the same year, the whole of Singapore Island was ceded to the British for a monetary payment. But in 1822 itself, Stamford Raffles had started working on a town plan for Singapore, creating districts such as the Commercial Square Business Hub and residential areas divided by ethnicity, which meant Chinatown for the Chinese and Kampong Glam, where the Muslims and the ethnic Arabs settled. Now, in this region of Malaysia and Singapore, there were 4 trade centers which were under British Crown: Penang, Singapore, Malacca, and Labuan. And these were collectively grouped as the Straits Settlements and considered a British colony. In 1842, the British developed a rival port, Hong Kong. And Singapore, as a trade center, took a hit because of that. And it continued to suffer as the French developed Saigon and Haiphong in Vietnam as trade centers, and the Dutch established ports and shipping lines in the Dutch East Indies, which is present-day Indonesia. In 1869, the Suez Canal was opened, and that heralded a new era with respect to international trade. And for Singapore, the impact was the construction of 3 miles or 5 kilometers of wharves at Tanjong Pagar, making it like a port terminal. And several decades later, in 1921, a naval base. With the advent of the Industrial Revolution, the demand for tin and rubber in the West made Singapore one of the greatest ports in the world. After World War I, steps were taken to modernize the Malayan defenses, and as the Anglo-Japanese alliance ended, building a large naval base in Singapore became important. So with all these factors working together, Singapore became a booming trading post in the late 19th century and early 20th century. But then World War II happened. The Japanese bombed Singapore in 1941 and defeated the British in the Battle of Singapore. This led to Singapore being under Japanese occupation from 1942 to 1945. At the time, it was renamed Seonyan To, or the Light of the South Island. In 1945, after Japan's surrender, Singapore once again came under British control. Post-World War II, while Singapore was still under British control, the British gradually increased levels of self-government on the island. Subsequently, on April 1, 1946, Singapore became a separate crown colony with a civil administration headed by a governor. National sentiment grew among the local population, and this led to the country's first general election in 1959, which saw Lee Kuan Yew becoming the first Prime Minister of Singapore. Though Singapore had established itself as a trading hub, the challenge was that it did not have access to natural resources. So it could not sustain itself on its own. So it looked at Malaysia as a country that could adopt Singapore, and this would lead to both regions benefiting from each other. On July 9, 1963, Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew signed the Malaysia Agreement in London. This agreement spelled out the terms for the formation of the Federation of Malaysia, which comprised Singapore, Malaya, Sarawak, and North Borneo. And this federation would take effect on 31st of August 1963. Now, in the run-up to the signing of the agreement, there was a lot of negotiations that happened, and these centered around Singapore's autonomy, Singapore's political representation in the federal government, the status of its citizens, and Singapore's revenue contribution to the Malaysian federal government. And once these issues were settled, the path was laid for the creation of the Federation of Malaysia with these 4 regions. When logic ends, politics begins. And in case of this merger, though it made sense economically, politically, there were cultural differences between Singapore and the rest of Malaysia. Singapore was more culturally cosmopolitan, and its leaders promoted the slogan Malaysian Malaysia to promote racial equality across the country. The Malay leaders were looking to grant special privileges and rights to the Malay community, which went against the thought process of the Singapore's political leaders. This led to escalation in tensions, which erupted into racial violence in Singapore in July and September of 1964. By August of 1965, as the tensions between the two sides continued to flare, the Malay side started overtly looking at ejecting Singapore from Malaysia. Several closed-door meetings were held, and finally, on August 9, 1965, at 10 a.m., Radio Singapore announced the separation of Singapore from Malaysia to become an independent and sovereign state. Singapore was now the master of its destiny, but it had to deal with the economic handicap of a lack of natural resources. So the primary question before Singapore was what strategy needed to be adopted so Singapore economy could sustain itself. As the experts around Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew pondered this question, one option stood out, and that was industrialization. Industrialization sounded great, but the question was how to entice investors and industrialists to set up shop in Singapore when there were so many more attractive options around. Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew's economic think tank was led by Goh Keng Swee, who's often considered the architect of Singapore's economy. And Goh Keng Swee came up with a brilliant idea to solve this problem. And the answer was to leapfrog the region and link it up directly with the developed world. Developed world meaning America, Europe, and Japan. The approach was to attract the manufacturers from these regions to produce in Singapore and export their products to the developed countries. So essentially, a multinational offshore manufacturing center. But how was Singapore going to make itself attractive to these first world manufacturers? In their own words, Singapore was going to create a first world oasis in a third world region. Wait, what does that even mean? What it means is that Singapore needed to be more robust, better organized, and more efficient than the other countries in the region. If Singapore were only as good as its neighbors, there was no reason for businesses to come to Singapore. So Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew and his advisors set out to woo the US industrialists through a series of talks. The breakthrough came in 1968 when Texas Instruments started the production of semiconductors, which was a very high-tech product at the time, in Singapore. This was followed very closely by National Semiconductors, and then Hewlett-Packard and General Electric set up different facilities across Singapore. By the 1980s, Singapore had become a major electronics exporter, and by 1997, with 200 US manufacturing companies, the total investment from these companies was approximately 19 billion US dollars. And it was not just electronics. Shell and Exxon set up refineries to lay the foundation for the chemical industry in Singapore. And with all these manufacturers in Singapore, this triggered the growth of the service industry to service the rapidly expanding economy. Moreover, Lee Kuan Yew was convinced that a thriving economy needed a world-class airport to support it. So subsequently, the Royal Air Force's Changi Air Base was expanded through reclaimed land and developed to rank as one of the finest airports in the world. And that is true even today. All right, so we have Singapore becoming the manufacturing hub within the Asia-Pacific region. But how did it end up as a financial center within that region? Well, that came about from a chance observation. The daily financial world went to sleep when San Francisco closed in the afternoon. And it stayed asleep until Zurich opened the following morning. So the question was asked, could Singapore fill in the gap and thus deliver a 24-hour round-the-clock world service in money and banking? The answer was yes, and it did. By the 1990s, Singapore had become the fourth largest financial center in the world after London, New York, and Tokyo. So how was all of this made possible? Meaning, to attract investment and become the manufacturing and the financial hub, you need a solid physical infrastructure and back it up with an abundance of qualified labor. So this had to be started with building state-of-the-art infrastructure and excellent air and sea linkages. The tax regime needed to be low and transparent. Bureaucracy needed to be clean and efficient. The regulatory and legal framework needed to be strong. And Singapore's diplomatic policy needed to be neutral so it could tap into both the US and China markets. And at the top, despite the ethnic and religious diversity, the social fabric needed to be very closely knit. So Singapore's key competitive advantage was going to be its human capital. And that would be possible only with a top-flight public education system. So while the system was fair and free, there was no room for complacency or corruption. So Lee Kuan Yew's focus was not on policy, because any policy could be reversed over time. His focus was on building solid institutions within the country. Institutions that were unparalleled so could not be dismantled. The examples being a very fair and efficient rule of law, efficient government structures, and the continuous fight against corruption. And most important of all, especially to attract foreign investment, a stable economic and political structure. But the population of Singapore around that time was just about 2 million people. So it was not practical to assume that they alone could supply all the human labor, which meant Singapore had to be welcoming of skilled immigrant labor. So the population needed to expand by continually attracting high caliber people who would create employment, bring in the capital, and most importantly, pass on their skills. And this has been one of the key policies that has led to decades of sustained economic growth for Singapore. The economic growth also necessitated that on the political front, Singapore ensured that it was protected and had a voice in the region. So gradually, Singapore started taking a more active role in regional diplomacy. Singapore became a founding member of the ASEAN, or the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, in 1967, and by 1980, it had emerged as one of ASEAN's leaders. Singapore's most important element of its success were its human resources. But it was important to ensure that the human resources were happy so they would stay in Singapore. How did Singapore achieve that? 2 words: affordable housing. In 1964, the government introduced the Home Ownership for the People scheme. Lee Kuan Yew believed that the home ownership would give every citizen a stake in a country of immigrants with no shared history. So how did Singapore make housing affordable to the common citizen? There were 2 factors in play here. One, Singapore's Housing and Development Board, or HDB, built hundreds of thousands of apartments as part of their housing projects. And the developments were organized as new towns, that is, self-contained neighborhoods, which had restaurants, shops, schools, and religious institutions. Each town center had a clinic, a bus terminal, a subway station, or a mall. A variety of these apartments were built, known as HDB flats, to suit different household needs and budgets. The size of the apartments varied from 1 bedroom to 3 bedroom, 2 bath. And how were these made affordable? The government allowed citizens to use their savings from a government retirement fund to pay for the down payment and monthly mortgage installments for the apartment. It also introduced other programs and grants to help low-income families. As a result of this, by 1985, virtually every Singaporean was living in a home. So what was the end result of this economic turnaround? Well, the Singapore GDP skyrocketed from less than $1 billion in 1960 to approximately $300 billion in 2014. The GDP per capita grew from $427 to an astonishing $55,000 over the same period. And it is on that positive note that we end this section of the program. On to the quiz section. Question from the previous episode. Who is the only Indian president to exercise their pocket veto? The Indian Post Office Amendment Bill of 1986 gave the executive extensive powers to intercept personal communication. The President of India at the time, Gyani Zail Singh, exercised his pocket veto to prevent the bill from becoming law. So the answer is B, Gyani Zail Singh. Question for the current episode. The national language of Singapore is Malay, but Singapore has 4 official languages. Which are these? Are these A. English, Japanese, Chinese, and Malay? B. English, French, Malay, and Japanese? C. English, Chinese, Tamil, and Malay? Or D. English, Japanese, Malay, and Tagalog? Once again, the national language of Singapore is Malay, but Singapore has 4 official languages. Which are these? A. English, Japanese, Chinese, and Malay? B. English, French, Malay, and Japanese? C. English, Chinese, Tamil, and Malay? Or D. English, Japanese, Malay, and Tagalog? The answer will be provided in the next episode. That's all we have in the current episode. In the next episode, we take a look at the physics of dictatorships. That is, how do countries turn into dictatorships? Or how do dictators take over? We'll analyze the patterns from history and share observations. So don't forget to tune in. Till then, stay safe and keep exploring the why in history.